Assalamu alaikum. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Let me just check the sound. Had some issues with the mic. Bismillah, jazakallah khairah everyone for joining. Today I wanted to discuss some recent events with you and some thoughts and reflections on the terrible tragedy that we all witnessed in New Zealand, where 50 of our brothers and sisters became shuhada because of the actions of killers who killed them for being Muslim, murdered them in cold blood. So this is something that has really affected so many of us, and I myself was really shocked and appalled by what I saw. Different clips that initially had were being spread through social media and WhatsApp, and it's just something that is so horrifying and shocking. Given that this is the masjid, you had Muslims coming for prayer, Salatul Jumu'ah, and the masjid, it looked very similar to the masjid that some of the masajid that I go to, with that kind of carpet, that kind of entrance with the shoes on the rack. And so subhanallah, you see something like that, and it really makes you feel very viscerally that this could happen to you. And at any moment, Allah decides when we live and when we die. And we just hope that we leave this dunya in a good state, and that we do become shuhada in the way that Allah decides. And this is something that we should, not necessarily in that way to be murdered in that kind of way, but we should aspire to be shaheed, on the path of truth and on the path of Islam. And this is something that is very clear that we know within Islam, and when we look at the Sahaba themselves and what they would say regarding fighting for the sake of Allah and being on the path of Allah. And so this is a good end that Muslims aspire to, again, not necessarily in that way, but in the way of becoming mina shuhada, from the martyrs. So we pray that Allah forgives them, forgives us. We know that they have not died, as Allah says in the Quran. Those who are shaheed, they are not dead. They are alive, in fact, and they're with Allah. And so we should recognize that and always keep that in mind, that whenever a tragedy like this befalls Muslims, that is something that we have to be patient with. We have to have sabr, and we have to always prepare ourselves for death. Every soul will taste death, so we have to be always ready for that, and make sure that we have prepared ourselves with what we have done in our lives. So I wanted to discuss some of the things that has occurred in the past 3 days since that shooting, the Muslim community's reactions, areas where I think that there could be potential problems with how we react to these events. I want to talk a little bit about white nationalism and the alt-right, and to what extent they should be blamed for this kind of massacre. And then I also want to look at the actual event itself and the shooting and what took place. And there seems to me to be many unanswered questions, many issues, anomalies, oddities that have come up. And if you carefully look at what the news is reporting, there is conflicting information. And so, as Muslims, should we look more closely at this information? Should we point out the contradictions? What is the benefit of doing that? Is there a benefit? And what are the kind of open questions that we need to address and hopefully get answers to? So these are the kinds of things that I want to discuss, and I think that some people have a hesitation to get into these kinds of questions, especially in the Muslim community, because they think it's you're acting like a conspiracy theorist, and that's a word that has bad connotations. If you're a conspiracy theorist, it means you're not really in touch with reality. You're not really in touch with what official authorities say, and that means you're going against the mainstream narrative, and the only people who go against a mainstream narrative are those who are crazy or who have some kind of issue. But history has shown that often those who are asking questions and who show skepticism with what is being blasted constantly within mainstream narratives, within the mainstream news, from government sources, those who have just skepticism, right? You don't have to propose an alternative right off the bat because there's limited information. Those who are willing to ask questions and raise, flags on things that don't make sense, history often shows that they were correct to be skeptical, and what has actually happened is not what was initially reported within the news. And there are many examples of this, and inshallah we're going to talk about some of these examples on this episode, inshallah. So as usual, before getting into the topics, let's start with some Quran, a relevant ayah. My contacts are acting up. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وإذا جاءهم أمر من الأمن أو الخوف أذاعوا به ولو ردوه إلى الرسول وإلى أولي الأمر منهم لعلمه الذين يستنبطونه منهم ولولا فضل الله عليكم ورحمته لاتبعتم الشيطان إلا قليلا صدق الله العظيم. This is an ayah from Surah An-Nisa, and in this ayah Allah says, the translated meaning of this is, and when there comes to them information about security, like public security or fear, they spread it around. They spread around this information. But if they had referred it back to the messenger, or to those of authority among them, then the ones who can draw correct conclusions from it would have known about it. And they would have understood it. And if not for the fadl, for the favor of Allah upon you and His rahmah, you would have followed shaitan. Except for a few. Illa qalila. So this is Allah's guidance on issues where there's news that has come. This is exactly relevant to the situation that we have with news about safety and fear. And this information is being spread far and wide. And it was spread immediately, right? Because the shooting was live streamed. This shooter streamed himself, and then that was broadcast. That was on social media. And even before the mainstream news broadcasted on some of these forums, like 8chan, 4chan, some of these alt-right fora online were distributing it and spreading it. So this is something that is directly addressed by this ayah in Surah An-Nisa. And then Allah is saying that take this issue, take this matter, and refer it back to the Prophet ﷺ or those of authority among you. And so this is an issue. So who are the ones who have authority among us? And this is a big question, the question of authority, but it's the ulama, it's the kibar al-ulama, the elders amongst the scholars, who we should consider them as the people of authority among us, ulil amr. So this is something that we have to ask ourselves. Do we refer to the people of knowledge? Do we look to the people of knowledge to help us understand what has taken place? Or are we drawing conclusions based on what we see from others who do not have knowledge, who don't care about the truth necessarily, who don't care about guidance and Islam and the Muslim community, the Ummah? So we have to prioritize and have a correct, this is in philosophy, they call this epistemology. Epistemology means, what do you know? What is knowledge? How do you acquire knowledge? How is knowledge justified? This is all epistemology. So in this ayah, this is referring to what the correct epistemology is for us as believers. The correct epistemology is to refer matters back to the ones who have knowledge, the ones who have authority in virtue of their knowledge. That is the correct way to verify information and to, in fact, understand and draw conclusions from news. Just because something is spread and everyone is saying the same thing, and you watch the news, you open your news feed on social media, and everyone has the same opinion and the same view, that doesn't mean that it is solid knowledge, right? That doesn't mean that it's solid knowledge. So this is an important distinction, that believers should not be gullible. Believers should not be gullible. If we follow what people are saying without verifying, and it's possible, I'm not saying that all media is inherently false or distorting the truth. No, in many cases, the media does report the truth accurately, but there are many examples where they do not, and they have twisted facts to influence the population, to influence the public in specific ways. So as believers, we don't want to be subject to manipulation in the same way. And this is the wisdom, the hikmah of Islam. This is the guidance that is coming to us. Okay, show me another book. Okay, show me another religion where this kind of specific guidance is coming to avoid being manipulated by voices that are simply powerful voices because they have the most money, they have the most power, and they're spreading information, and they're manipulating people on the basis of that information. So Islam has explicit, very specific guidance on this issue, and it's extremely relevant to us in this day and age, whether it's with regard to this past weekend and the shooting that happened on Friday, or just any kind of news. So we have to take things back to what ulama say. And as a practical tip, what did the elder scholars say? Are you aware of it? Are you aware of what how they interpreted? I recommend that you actually go and thanks to online technology, you can go and see what elder scholars have said. Okay, what they have said on this and how they interpreted it. And I encourage you to actually go and seek that out. And I'm not going to give you specific names because then you're going to just take that and say, well, Daniel is biased towards certain people and he's not biased towards others. So I'm going to avoid specific names as I usually do, but I recommend that you go and check, the people who maybe they're not in the US, right? Maybe they're not in the United States. Maybe they're not in the West. How do they interpret these kinds of things? And these are people that have knowledge and they have scholarship that they're speaking in light of. Okay, so that's the first point. The second point, in terms of how we react to these kinds of tragedies, we have to ask ourselves, are we acting on the basis of dunya, or are we acting on the basis of akhirah? Are we acting on the basis of what is apparent, what is seen, or are we acting on the basis of the ghaib, the unseen? So some of the things that are concerned with the unseen are things like salah, like prayer. Have we prayed extra prayers, maybe 2 rakat you can pray, or make dua for those families who have lost their loved ones. Make dua for the shuhada, make dua for the ummah to be protected from these kinds of calamities. We understand as believers that the world is not just what we see around us. Reality is not just what we see. It's also the unseen. And in fact, the unseen is more efficacious. The unseen, the ghaib, has more of an impact. Okay? It has the definitive impact on what happens in the dunya. Okay? What we see, the asbab, right? The different causes and the different things that we see around us, these are not truly what is in control. Allah is the one who is in control of all of our affairs, and every single thing that happens in the dunya is in the hands of Allah. So have we truly internalized this? Where, again, how are we acting when we hear news and we verified news? We know that people have been killed. We know that people have been slaughtered, that Muslims have been made shaheed. So we have to be able to turn our hands in prayer to Allah and make dua to protect us from this and to forgive us and save us from calamities like this. And of course, we should always keep in mind, as I mentioned, that we don't lose people, we don't lose Muslims when they are killed like this, when they're murdered like this, because we know they become shaheed, and the shuhada are not dead, they in fact are alive. What we do lose Muslims to is when someone loses their iman, loses his iman. If a Muslim loses his iman, then that is a true loss. That is the loss of a Muslim. So we have to always keep these kinds of distinctions in mind. And the third point is, when we have these kinds of tragedies, we have to understand that, if this affected us, this shooting in New Zealand, and it should affect us, it should have a profound effect on us in the ways that I mentioned, in reorienting ourselves and realizing that this life is transient, this dunya, we're only here for a limited amount of time, and then everyone will die and then be resurrected in the akhirah. But we have to recognize that these kinds of tragedies are happening on a frequent and regular basis. Okay, masjids are being bombed. Masjids are being leveled. Believers are being attacked and killed all over the world. And we see this in Gaza, we see this in Palestine, we see this in China, with Muslims in China are being detained and thrown in concentration camps. We see this in Burma with the Rohingya. We see in India, we see in Kashmir, we see all over the world. These kinds of tragedies and these kinds of calamities are happening with frequency, with great frequency. And just reflecting on myself, it causes you to be numb. It causes you to be numb to the suffering of our brothers and sisters in the Ummah. And so I was reflecting on that. That do I have the same kind of reaction to this kind of event on Friday versus other events that are constantly taking place, and Muslims are being killed and attacked in the most barbaric ways. So this is something that we really need to reflect on, and we really need to understand that it's not just Muslims in the West. In fact, Muslims in the West have a lot of advantages and are in some ways much safer than Muslims in other parts of the world. And so we have to pray to Allah to help our brothers and sisters. We have to do what we can to help them. If we can send money, if we can rally politically in order to change the situation, then this is what we need to do. Or we can speak out against these atrocities. We can constantly be raising the alarm to what is happening to the Ummah all across the globe. So let me just stop for your questions or comments, and then we'll continue, inshallah. Is everyone able to see? Okay, how can we differentiate between solid news and misinformation when they are spread from the same channels? This is a question from Adil. So this is a good question. We differentiate by, first of all, again, referring to ulul amr. This is what Allah commands us in the Quran. And if there are signs usually of something that being disinformation, of something being questionable. One sign of this is that everyone agrees on a narrative and it's mass distributed very quickly, before even the bodies have been buried. You have the same story being broadcast from all the mainstream channels. Okay, this is a sign that would raise a question. Another sign is that the certain major details of what is reported on a piece of information or a piece of news changes without that change being noted explicitly. And we're going to talk about that when it comes to the New Zealand shooting. Initial reports said that there are multiple shooters, that there were explosives being used, that this is what the police were reporting, and the mainstream news was transmitting that within the first few hours. But then there's no talk about any of this, and the narrative completely turns 180 degrees. And then that change, that sudden change, is not recognized or is not noted within those same channels. So this is a sign. Okay, this is a sign that there's something that needs to be addressed. There's a question here. And so we're going to look at specific details when it comes to that as well. So Claire says, are you saying white people have to just keep accepting immigration? So we're going to talk about white nationalism later. Can you address, Jack says, can you address the importance of self-defense and firearms training to secure our masajid and Islamic schools? So this is, I think, important. Self-defense is always important. And the Prophet ﷺ has said in authentic hadith that the strong believer is better than the weak believer. There's many different ways that you can understand this hadith and different ways that scholars have interpreted this hadith. But the strong, it can mean physical strength. The strong believer is better than the weak believer. And so we have to strive to make ourselves strong. whether it's through learning martial arts, whether it's through weightlifting, whether it's through becoming more athletic. These are all important things. As far as masajid, I have talked to different imams at different masajid, different board members. And so people are already thinking about different ways to increase security and improve security. I think the consensus is that many masajid have already security guards. Some masajid don't have armed security guards. If there's not the ability to, or there's not the money to be able to afford armed security personnel to guard the masjid, then it's possible for responsible individuals that are assigned to, go through the training and become licensed and can, carry a concealed weapon, and they will be at the masjid, especially for Salatul Jumu'ah, and even maybe they won't pray at the same time as the Jama'ah, but they will watch and guard the congregation. So these are all suggestions. I think that Muslims should be taking steps in general to protect themselves, not necessarily in light of this particular shooting, but in general. This is something that Muslims have to be aware of. Okay. Abdullah says, are you satisfied with the response of the English-speaking imams? So this is something that I will definitely talk about, inshallah. Now let me check Facebook. Abu Dawood says, Assalamu alaikum. Wa alaikum assalam, brother. Thank you for joining. Let's see. Okay, Dean Reminder also asked the same question. Should we make a routine for a party to guard Muslims during Jumu'ah in the West? I think it's something to consider for sure. And like I said, already there are masajid who are considering this option. Knowledgeable people who are talking about, okay, let's have brothers concealing their weapon and have them be trained. So one of the jokes was the Muslim in some of these masajid, there's a lot of hotheads. So we have to be careful not to arm them or make sure that they're not carrying weapons into the masjid. But beyond that, those kinds of practical considerations, safety is important. And others, when you're living in a country where semi-automatic weapons are legal, you can have a license. I live in Texas, so it's legal to conceal carry or open carry weapons, firearms. So this is, why shouldn't Muslims have that kind of recourse to those kinds of firearms as well? And I think as long as Muslims are responsible with weapons of this nature, then that's really the important concern. Don't just go buy a gun without training or without a license or without the right kind of background to do so. Okay, so now let's talk about the Muslim community's response. How can we understand what has happened? So what my concern is, and that's the whole theme of this episode, is acting in haste. Acting in haste without having all the information. Because when you act in haste, then you risk shooting yourself in the foot, right? If you respond in a way that is unwise or is not with the full picture, then you can later be, that action can be used against you at a later point. That action can come and, hit you over the head because you didn't fully think through the action that you took. And so again, this is why we refer matters to those of authority, because people, and I specifically mentioned kibar al-ulama, the elders among the ulama, and there's a distinction there. Okay, it's an important distinction that sometimes I feel younger Muslims don't make. They think, oh well, he's a sheikh, so he's a scholar. He's an imam. He's a scholar. Yeah, okay. There are people who are studying and who have reached a certain level of knowledge, and they have ijaza and so forth. But what about the elders? Because what the elders have is experience. The elders have seen so many things in life, and specifically when it comes to tragedies and these kinds of calamities, they've lived through, some of them have lived through major difficulties and trials and tribulations. And so they are able to have a much broader view, a much wider view, and they are not susceptible to fall into making hasty conclusions because they've lived through the aftermath and they have that hindsight. So that's another reason why we have to refer these issues to and go back to the elders. Unfortunately, the way that some within the Muslim community act is to say that, well, these elders, what do they know? They are the least informed. They're the least informed when it comes to news and these kinds of current events. No, it's exactly the opposite. The elders, they might not know specific details, right? But they have the broader perspective. They have the broader experience that can help guide us in these kinds of difficult times. So this is exactly why we refer to them and not just think that we know better or, being younger is better. Okay, so far there's been a lot of haste. As I mentioned, the shooting just happened only 3 days ago. And already there's a confirmed narrative that, look, this guy, he was radicalized online. First of all, they say that there's just one shooter now. That's now the consensus. There was one guy acting alone. He was radicalized online through white nationalist, white supremacist discourse, and he lashed out and attacked these Muslims. And in fact, he has this manifesto that he wrote to explain his motives, and that's online and we can read it. And so now we have to have this kind of war against white nationalism. We have to battle this new threat, this new global threat of white nationalism. So this is the narrative, but I feel like there are a lot of nuances and a lot of issues that are being bowled over, and really we're not really seeing a lot of key details that would bring question to some of these issues. For example, a lot of people commenting on white nationalism don't know what white nationalism even is. A lot of people commenting on this issue seem to conflate white supremacy with white nationalism. In fact, these are different things. They're related, but they're separate trends and separate mindsets that we have to understand. So that's one thing that we're going to talk about, inshallah, in this episode. But let me give you an example of one situation where Muslims acted in haste. Muslims acted and spoke out and said things that later turned out to be not have any basis. And we ended up shooting ourselves in the foot in that situation. And it's the event that I'm referring to is the nightclub shooting in Orlando. This happened in 2016, and the nightclub was a LGBT gay nightclub, and a Muslim, Omar Mateen, allegedly went and killed 50 or 49 people in that club. 49 people. So that the mainstream narrative at that time was, look, this is a Muslim extremist. He is with ISIS and he's going to kill these homosexuals. That's what his motive was. He had a hatred of LGBT. He was himself gay and he wanted to act out because of being repressed by Islam, and so Islamic values against same-sex behavior repressed him, and therefore he exploded in this violent rampage, massacring 49 people at this gay club. That was the narrative, and it was being broadcast on all of the mainstream news. There was so much commentary on this idea of Islam's position on homosexuality, and the fact that Islam's position on homosexuality is dangerous. This is something that is what Islam teaches on LGBT is dangerous. It's actually posing a public security risk. And so there was all this pressure on the Muslim community, pressuring Muslims to respond in a certain way. And unfortunately, a lot of Muslims took the bait, because what came out is responses where Muslims were saying, look, Islam has nothing against same-sex behavior. Islam has nothing against LGBT. In fact, we have to fight LGBT hate. We have to fight homophobia. Muslims are together going to march against LGBT, and we're going to wave these rainbow flags at our, in our communities. So this was the kind of response that the Muslim community had because of the pressure that was coming through the mainstream media as well as social media. But the fact of the matter is, what came out later was that this shooter, there is no evidence that he specifically targeted that nightclub because it was a gay nightclub. There's no evidence that he targeted that nightclub because it was a gay nightclub. And let me read you a report that came out on this. And this made some news just in last year, actually, March of 2018. But it didn't get much coverage. Let me share. Okay, so this was reported in The Intercept. And I want to read you some of this because it's pretty shocking how different the facts are from the narrative that was being propagated at the time. Newly released evidence today calls into serious doubt many of the most widespread beliefs about the 2016 shooting by Omar Mateen at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, which killed 49 people along with Mateen himself. Because the attack occurred on the club's Latin night, the overwhelming majority of the victims were Latinos, primarily Puerto Ricans. In particular, Mateen went to Pulse only after having scouted other venues that night that were wholly unrelated to the LGBT community, only to find that they were too defended by armed guards and police, and ultimately he chose Pulse, the gay nightclub, after a generic Google search for Orlando nightclubs, not gay nightclubs. Okay. So several journalists closely covering the Mateen investigations have for some time now noted the complete absence of any evidence suggesting that Mateen knew that Pulse was a gay club or that targeting the LGBT community was part of his motive. These doubts have been strongly fortified by new facts previously under seal that were revealed by today's court filing. So in 2018, so 2 years after the actual shooting took place. So, and it goes into further details about this situation with his wife, who's being charged as a co-conspirator and helping him undertake this attack on the nightclub. So the reality is his wife didn't seem to have anything to do with it. But nonetheless, according to The Intercept, she is being prosecuted and in a highly unusual manner in a case that is riddled with evidentiary holes and seemingly designed to defeat and exploit community outrage that demands someone be punished for this massacre. So this is like a very startling kind of revelation, or a startling thing to say that they're prosecuting someone like the within Florida, the prosecutors are going after this Muslim woman with troubling and with a troubling case. Their case is riddled with holes. There's not really much evidence, but that doesn't stop the prosecution of this Muslim woman. Yeah, so the decision to prosecute Salman, which is the last name of his wife, is particularly odd given the Department of Justice's refusal to prosecute Mary Lou Danley, the girlfriend of Las Vegas shooter Stephen Paddock. So the Las Vegas shooting that happened last year, and about 50 people also were killed in that shooting, and his girlfriend was not prosecuted despite far greater evidence suggesting her foreknowledge of his plans. Additionally, the Department of Justice refused to prosecute Catherine Russell, the white ex-Christian wife, meaning, she's Muslim, I believe, Catherine Russell, the wife of alleged Boston Marathon bomber Tamerlan Tsarnaev, also in the face of evidence of possible complicity that was far greater than exists for Salman. So it's interesting, I think, that how the prosecutors, how the Department of Justice decides who to go after and who to prosecute, depending on the evidence or lack thereof. So, but the point that I'm making with this, with the Orlando shooting, is all of this media coverage saying that he was acting out of hatred for LGBT turned out to be completely baseless. But the haste in the Muslim community responding and reacting to this caused problems, because now you have Muslims who think that, well, we can't teach about Qawm Lut, we can't teach about LGBT, we can't teach again something like gender fluidity or or sexual orientation and what Islam has to say, what Allah has said about this issue. We can't teach that because we have gone on record standing with LGBT. We've gone on record denouncing homophobia. We've gone on record denouncing hate. Okay? We have written a statement, right? This was a statement that was signed on by many activists and also some younger scholars who signed on a statement that said and everyone has the right in America to live according to their lifestyle that they choose. So if someone has a gay lifestyle, well, that's their right, and they should be able to practice that. And so this is what the Muslim community signed on to, as far as those specific leaders, activists, and some of the young scholars signed on to that statement. If you want to look it up, it's called Open Letter, or it's called Open Letter from the Muslim Community in light of the Orlando shooting. So when that first came out, I advised people not to sign on to that statement because it's a problematic statement. Here, I'll bring it up so we can actually look at it. So this is what I wrote. I wrote this in response to what the leaders, activists, and community members were signing on to. So there's that. But where's the actual letter? Okay. For some reason I didn't link to it. Anyway, you can find it online. I don't know why it's not coming up. But I didn't want to go in depth on that whole fiasco, but it was just an example of how acting in haste can backfire majorly. And we see the same thing here. I think with some of the statements that Muslim activists and some of the leaders are saying. What I find it interesting, it's kind of a double standard that a lot of the reaction has been against hate. Okay, this shooting has happened, and we have to stand against hate. And hate is not being defined. Hate is not being defined, but that's important because, well, what is hate? What counts as hate? In Islam, we know that there are certain things that we have to hate as believers. We have to hate what Allah hates. And so if we're going to sign statements against hate, what does that actually commit us to? If we're going to make broad denunciations of hate, what does actually coming under the definition of hate? So these are the kinds of things that we have to recognize. We have to recognize that the understanding of hate within the dominant liberal conversation is expansive, and there are certain things that are included within the list of things that we shouldn't hate that in fact Allah hates and that we should hate. So we have to be aware of this dynamic. And also this whole idea of denouncing hate, I find it a double standard that when it comes to certain kinds of discrimination or bigotry as they define it, there's statements that are made specific to certain communities. So go back to just a couple of weeks in the whole controversy with Ilhan Omar. You had these senators, these Congress people asking for a statement in response to Ilhan Omar, a referendum to denounce anti-Semitism. So when, Ilhan Omar makes these kinds of remarks about the Israeli lobby in AIPAC, that's considered such a bigoted thing that Congress needs to draft a referendum against anti-Semitism. But when Muslims are being gunned down and killed in the masjid, then we have something that we have to denounce hate in general. It's not something specific to Islam. It's not something specific to Muslims. So that's something to pay attention to as well. So when we look at this response of attacking white nationalists, some of the things that white nationalists are being attacked for are things that Muslims also agree to in some areas, right? Because what's being said repeatedly within the news reports that you can see is that white nationalists have a us versus them mentality, an us versus them mentality, and that is what makes them bigoted. That's what makes them hateful, because they think it's us versus the other, and so this is, if Muslims adopt this kind of principle, that wherever there's an us versus them mentality that's bad, then that has implications for Islam. That has implications for the community. We have this concept within Islam, al-wala wal-bara. We have the concept of loyalty to the Ummah. We have loyalty to the Ummah, and we disavow, and we don't have the same kind of loyalty to non-Muslims. Okay? This is a very fundamental, important principle within Islam, al-wala wal-bara. And this is something that's very controversial. This is something that's very controversial because it's been made controversial by liberals, by the colonizers. I've discussed this in different places about how when the Muslim world was colonized, different Islamic teachings were attacked, and different Islamic teachings were essentially made illegal. You can't teach within the colonized Muslim world, you can't teach certain concepts like jihad, for example. You can't teach about jihad because that will threaten the colonizer. You can't teach about al-wala wal-bara. You can't teach this idea of the Ummah first. The Ummah comes first, because that threatens the colonizer, right? So these are things that, teachings that have been de-emphasized and almost even buried, where some people won't even talk about these concepts, even though they're important parts of the deen, and they're how we can understand the Quran and how we can understand the life of the Prophet ﷺ and the actions of the Sahaba. So these are important things that we can't lose sight of. But if we buy into this notion that us versus them as a concept is completely illegitimate, then this concept within Islam also comes under attack. And critics can say, okay, you Muslims, you're saying that you're opposed to an us versus them mentality. Well, what about this teaching of al-wala wal-bara? What about this kind of ummah first mentality that you have? It's not, why are you so concerned about the ummah, right? Why are you concerned about the ummah? We're all human beings. We're all in one human family. And we see this kind of teaching that's being spread by, what I think are certain compromised teachers, compromised scholars who are pushing these kinds of liberal ideas and pushing the colonial mindset. And they'll say things like, humanity before religiosity. Humanity before religiosity. This is the line that is being spread through peace conferences in the Gulf and elsewhere. That we have to emphasize that we're all part of the same human family. We're all, so this has a consequence. Okay? And I'm not saying, so the contrast that's made, or this is the kind of unfair framing that's given to this, is that, okay, if you're against us versus them, that means you're a bigot. That means you are a terrorist. That means that you're an extremist. No. You can have an ummah first mentality. You can practice al-wala wal-bara as a Muslim and still be kind to your non-Muslim neighbor, and still be generous to a non-Muslim guest. You can still have a friendly acquaintance or a friendly co-worker, non-Muslim, and be good to them, be honest with them, help them if they need help. This is all part of Islam. This does not contradict al-wala wal-bara. Okay? But having an ummah first mentality means that you care about the ummah, and you understand that the ummah has a struggle. We are struggling because of attacks on believers. Why do we find Muslims being killed in New Zealand and in India and in Kashmir and in China and in Israel and in Palestine and in Russia and in Syria and in Yemen and in Africa, in different parts of Africa? So this is something that what unites all of them are that they're believers, right? It's not a specific race. The one unifying characteristic of all of these people, they are believers. They believe in Allah and His Messenger, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So if you have an ummah first mentality, you recognize that this is what is this is the reality, that there is greater forces at play, forces that are trying to stamp out Islam, that want to extinguish the light of Islam. There are forces in the world that are acting in this way. If you think that, oh no, it's just bigotry, and you have these white nationalists and they hate a variety of people, and then you have other groups, then you are taking away from the reality of the situation. Okay? Yes, there are bigots. Yes, there are people who are acting in racist ways. No doubt about it. We also reject racism and race-based bigotry as Muslims. And there are further details on that. But we have to recognize that at the end of the day, there are powers who are specifically targeting Islam. They're targeting Islam. We have to never forget that. We never should forget this reality. But if we say that, oh, well, this is just a phenomenon of bigotry and racism and there are many targets of it, okay, fine. But we have to make a distinction. Okay? The imams who are saying that, we stand against hate and we stand against bigotry, are they conflating these issues? Are they mixing these issues in a way that we forget the larger struggle? Are we forgetting this attack on Islam? And this is a question that we have to ask. Because if you ask, this is seen as, if we say things like we have to be concerned about believers, we are one ummah, we have to, what the enemies of Islam can say is that, okay, well, what you just expressed, this mentality, this is exactly what the white nationalists think. The white nationalists also think, oh, we are a group of white people, we have a specific heritage, and it's us against the attacks from the outside. So Muslims have the same kind of paranoia as the white nationalists. And then what will Muslims say to that? That's a kind of trap that we don't want to fall into. What we would distinguish is say, well, as Muslims, we're following the truth. Islam is the truth. This is from Allah. This is from the Creator. What are white nationalists following? And this is something that I have a hard time understanding white nationalists themselves. Like, how can you base your identity on something so simplistic as the color of your skin and your so-called heritage, white heritage? What heritage is that? What heritage do Europeans have? Yes, there is a culture, but it's very diverse. You have various different strands of European history, and it's not based on a transcendent ideal. Religion has a transcendent ideal, God, and what God says, and what God has revealed, and a religion and messengers. That is transcendent. That is beyond time and space. But your past heritage, if that's all there is to it, that's very weak, right? Why should anyone care about what people did 100 years ago? Most of the things that were acceptable in European culture 100 years ago, white nationalists today would reject that. White nationalists would actually reject that kind of culture and that kind of heritage. So I find the whole white nationalist discourse not really even self-consistent and coherent. And so this is something that we can distinguish. But the point of the matter is that if we want to denounce us versus them, that has implications for Muslims. That has implications for how we can talk about our religion. Also, if some of the people who are commenting on the New Zealand shooting, some of the Muslims, are saying we need more surveillance, we need more censorship, we need more governmental forces reacting to this, putting resources into this to fight these white nationalists. Again, this is hasty. This is very hasty, because whenever government gets more power, whenever these governmental agencies have more authority to do surveillance, to monitor, to counter extremism, usually it's Muslims that are impacted by this. Usually Muslims are the ones who are targeted by this. So is it really wise to encourage the government within the US and these Western countries in general to have a more muscular police state? Is that really wise? We're going to be the first ones who suffer. We've already suffered a lot. Our communities have already suffered a lot from the expansion of government power. From the time of Bush, after 9/11, George W. Bush pushed the Patriot Act, Patriot Act, which expanded surveillance powers, expanded the right of the government to detain Muslims, expanded the right of the government to put Muslims in prison indefinitely without charges. All of these extrajudiciary powers, executive powers that were legislated after 9/11 in George W. Bush's time, also in Obama's time, right? Because Obama expanded the drone program, and Obama said that we have to have the right to target these terrorists that we suspect around the world. And yes, there might be casualties, but that's the price, that's the cost of fighting a global war on terror. So it was Barack Obama who expanded the ability or the rights of the drone program and the right of the executive to kill even U.S. citizens, to kill and drone U.S. citizens without trial, without any kind of due process. All the president has to say is that, yes, it looks like this guy is a terrorist. He is an American citizen, but it doesn't matter. We have to kill him. Okay? So that was a power, an executive power that Obama defended and expanded. So now with Trump, are we going to continue and demand more governmental power? Who's going to be the ones who are suffering, who are going to be targeted by this? Okay? Who's going to be targeted by this if we continue to empower the executive branch of government to fight extremism? So we can't be naive about these things. So, what's another point? Oh, the other thing, speaking of shooting ourselves in the foot, when we see Muslims are going to all these vigils, right? And they're standing with candlelight and so forth. And we also see non-Muslims coming to the masjid. And we see even non-Muslims praying and non-Muslims listening to the adhan. These are good things, right? It's good. These are acts of support, and we appreciate non-Muslims who are showing this support in light of the tragedy. But the one thing that Muslims have to also recognize, and this is the time to talk about it, right? Because this is when it's happening. The actions are happening right now, so we have to talk about it right now. Otherwise, if we talk about it in a month, then we might have already shot ourselves in the foot by then. But the point is that if we're participating in these kinds of vigils and we have non-Muslims are coming to the masjid and doing this, is there an understanding that if a tragedy befalls another community, another religious community, we're going to go to the church and pray? We're going to go to the synagogue, or we're going to go to the temple, and we're going to, do sajda, or bow our heads, or participate in the prayer of these other religions? Is there an understanding that that kind of reciprocity can't happen? And I'm afraid that a lot of younger Muslims don't really understand this. And I see this because you have activists who, unfortunately, they are uneducated on some of the basics of Islam. You have activists who are going to these churches, not related to any kind of tragedy, just normal day, going to a church and streaming it. They stream themselves, praying in mass, like a Catholic mass, or at a black church, and they say, oh, this is so powerful, this is so beautiful. So what are you really saying? Like that prayer is shirk, right? This is associating partners with Allah. Or this is an act of kufr that you are participating in. You are bowing your head in that kind of kufr. So this is, unfortunately, the boundaries when it comes to multi-faith events. There's not a basic education that the Muslim community in certain areas has on this issue, and it lends itself to especially the younger generation, falling into thinking that it's okay. It's okay to go to church. It's okay to pray with them because they do it for us. And we're all human beings. We're all happy family, a happy interfaith family. So if they do this, we have to reciprocate in the same way, and so on and so forth. So this is the danger of emphasizing, humanity over religiosity. and this kind of liberal mindset that comes with it. Okay, let me address some questions before moving on. Reg says, I think we forget the power of words. Absolutely, this is a very important point. Words have consequences because later you can be held to account for the things that you say in this life and in the next, obviously. Okay. Yeah, another difference, Ibrahim Abu Sami mentions that another important difference between the white nationalists and Islam and Muslims is that Islam is open to people of any race. Right, this is very important. We don't distinguish people, the value of a person based on the color of their skin or even necessarily the culture that they're coming from or the ethnicity that they're coming from. This is one of the signs in this life is that Allah has created people in a variety of ways, right? Different colors, different practices. But the distinction is that we judge people on the basis of their taqwa. We judge people on the basis of the acceptance of truth and the rejection of falsehood, right? That is what defines who a Muslim is. We can't say that someone who is rejecting Islam and who is committing shirk or who is worshipping a man like Jesus, or is worshipping stones or false gods, that is equivalent, that kind of kufr is equivalent to belief, to iman. We can't say that. We shouldn't say that because it's not true. And we should have more of an affinity for believers in this way. But it's based on the truth. It's not on the basis of, oh, we're Arab. Because so many Muslims are not Arab. Or, you're Middle Eastern, I'm Middle Eastern, so we, have an affiliation with each other and we protect each other and we fight for our interests. No, this is asabiya. This is unsuriya. This is a tribalism, a blameworthy kind of tribalism that Islam rejects, roundly rejects. Whereas the white nationalists this is what they argue for on the basis of a shared heritage. I mean, let me talk about white nationalists in a second, but first let me make sure that I address all these questions. Anti Hasbara says a great point. No white nationalist will agree with another white nationalist in who is actually white and what is considered white. Yeah, they're very confused amongst themselves, which is characteristic of falsehood. Falsehood breeds more falsehood, more confusion. Let's see. So some of the comments are on white nationalism, which we'll talk about in a second. All right, so understanding white nationalism is important. I think that a lot of Muslims don't really recognize what white nationalism is, and they kind of have a very simplistic understanding of this because their understanding is based on what the mainstream media is saying. And the mainstream media also is very simplistic in their representation of white nationalism. So I think if we understand it, we can better react to it and better protect ourselves from it and better dismantle it and better do da'wah to those who are preaching it. Because just because someone is a white nationalist doesn't mean that they can never, that they'll never be Muslim or that they're closed off to Islam. And this is something that is sometimes in the news. You have former white nationalists who have embraced Islam, high profile white nationalists who have seen the beauty of Islam and have become Muslim. And so this is something that we have to recognize, that everyone is open to guidance, and Allah can guide whomever He wills. But if you have this kind of, it's the this kind of insaniya, or the humanity before religion, that kind of liberal mindset is actually leading to a kind of tribalism. Because I see Muslims saying that, oh, white nationalists, these are the scum of the earth, may Allah curse them, and may Allah do this and that. Yeah, some of them are very bad, no doubt about it. So let no one say that I'm defending white nationalists, or I am trying to promote white nationalism, or I am saying that Muslims should ally with white nationalism. I am not saying that. I am not saying that. I'm saying that white nationalists, white conservatives, the alt-right, the far left, progressive left, all of humanity, we should be willing to call to Islam. We should call to Islam. We shouldn't be naive either, in the sense that we defend ourselves and we fight for ourselves, we fight for the Ummah, of course. But even when the believers are fighting, the goal is to save. The goal is for the salvation of as many as possible. And we see this amongst the Sahaba as well. We see this amongst the Sahaba, where they were fighting the kuffar, they were fighting the mushrikeen, but then many of the mushrikeen became Muslim. They left kufr and they became believers. Does that mean that the Muslims thought less of them? Does that mean that the Muslims considered them to be somehow of a lower status because they had a history of kufr? No, they were at the same level as all other believers, and some of them even progressed and became some of the greatest Sahaba. The best example being Omar, for example, radiallahu anhu. So we have to have the same kind of hope, that the beauty of Islam can be recognized by some of people who are engaged in some of the most ugly and vile discourse, such as these white nationalists. So what do the white nationalists say? They say that, look, white people need their own country. White people have a shared heritage. So we have to have our own nation. Just like you have Israel. Israel is for Jews. It's an ethno-state for Jews. You have China. China is an ethno-state for Chinese. India is an ethno-state, or they're trying to make it an ethno-state for Hindus. And many other countries around the world, they're saying they all have their own countries based on ethnicity. Well, why can't white people have their own country based on ethnicity? And so this is an argument that you're not going to find with discussed in mainstream media. Why? Because it puts pressure on countries like Israel. It puts pressure on countries like China and India. It makes them look bad because they're implementing policies that are in line with white nationalist thought. Right? Because Israel does restrict immigration. Israel does restrict race mixing. Jews marrying non-Jews within Israel. These kinds of policies are dictating the population of Israel to make sure that there's a Jewish majority. Same thing in China. What are they doing in China? Part of it is they're interning Muslims who are ethnically not part of the majority ethnicity within China. So they're interning Muslims. They're also encouraging that the Muslims marry non-Muslims, that they marry them into the majority race. This is how they want to dilute the population of that ethnicity that the Muslims are belonging to. And the similar kinds of things in India. They want to maintain a demographic majority for one specific ethnicity, and they want to limit the amount of immigration. So this is exactly what the white nationalists also claim. They say that in The West, we used to have a majority. Whites used to be the majority, but then due to immigration and then due to intermarrying, our population is dropping. And also, they say that due to things like feminism, due to things like LGBT, due to the breakdown of the family structure and the weakening of marriage bonds, these are things that have all affected the white race and has led to lower demographic numbers. And so they bemoan these things. So these are things that we have to understand, like what is their argument and how can we respond to this argument? What can we say against this? One of the things that we can say against white nationalists is, look, you have these nations, these European nations and America have engaged in imperialism and colonialism for centuries, literally centuries. And you have invaded and you have genocided and you have taken over so much of the world. And now you want to claim that you want to have a white nation, independent, secluded from everyone else. So that's too little too late, right? You can't have your cake and eat it too, as they say, or eat your cake and have it too. You've engaged in all of this destruction around the world against non-whites, and now you want to claim that whites deserve their own country. So this is one kind of argument that you can make against these white nationalists. And add to the fact that many of the areas that are considered white now and have a white ethnic majority were not white ethnic majorities in the past. Like the United States itself. In North America, an entire population had to be wiped out, had to be genocided, the Native Americans, in order to make room, quote unquote, for the white colonizer. So this is the European colonizer. So this is something that the white nationalist discourse has, problems, inconsistencies, incoherences that can easily be brought up. And some of the things that they say against feminism and LGBT, the breakdown of family values, those are things that affect Muslims as well. So white people are not the only race, they're not the only group of people who are negatively affected by feminism and LGBT and the breakdown of family. No, Muslims are affected as well. Muslim marriages are also affected and are weakened by some of these societal forces that are affecting the population as a whole. So in those cases, we should be doing our own research and we should be able to do our own critiques and see how Muslims are affected. Muslims of all races, white Muslims, black Muslims, Indian Muslims, and so forth, by these kinds of larger societal forces. But again, if we tend to have this idea that anything that's coming or is accepted by or is endorsed by white nationalists is for the garbage, yeah, many of the things that they say are completely vile garbage. But this point is something that we can benefit from, or we can recognize and do our own research and verify that are Muslims being affected in this negative way because of these kinds of societal forces? How is the birth rate of Muslims affected when you promote a kind of feminist mentality? How are marriages affected? What's the divorce rate amongst Muslims when you are promoting these kinds of liberal ideologies? So white nationalists, they get it. They understand that there's a huge danger that is affecting the character, the moral character of society. And they are reacting against that. But Muslims, if we just want to reject everything that they say and have this knee-jerk acceptance of whatever is coming from the liberal left, then we're going to miss these kinds of important points. And I know that people are going to distort what I'm saying here. They're going to say that Daniel wants Muslims to ally with the white nationalists. And this is what immediately after the shooting happened, news broke of the shooting in New Zealand. I was getting messages from people, certain individuals like that guy in the UK, Abu Laith. I don't know if you know who this guy is, but he wrote a post against me saying that, oh, what does Daniel have to say now? Does he still think that Muslims have to be allying with the alt-right? And that's a complete distortion. That's complete slander because I've never said that Muslims should ally with a particular party, with a particular political party. That's the opposite of what I've been saying. I've been saying that Muslims need to base their politics on the Quran and Sunnah, not on affiliation with this or that party, because many of the things that the left says and the right says, we completely reject and are completely un-Islamic. So to say that I am pushing pushing Muslims to ally with the alt-right or with Republicans, this is all slander. They want to just discredit me by making up things that are not true. Okay. Any questions? So Hajj Adnan asks, Ustad Daniel, what would be the Islamic policy on immigration if there was a pure Islamic state? Would it be restricted? Well, there are restrictions already. For example, in Mecca and Medina, non-Muslims are not allowed to enter those holy cities, right? That's a restriction on movement. And the scholars have also written that Dar al-Islam, there are restrictions in non-Muslims being able to come into Muslim lands. And there are restrictions in how, non-Muslims can move around and preach their religion in Muslim lands. So these are all restrictions. So when we want to think about our situation today, I think that there are a lot of issues that have to be considered, and it requires a mujtahid, someone to do ijtihad, a scholar, a faqih, a true faqih, to be able to look at the situation and understand how to implement those kinds of restrictions in this present day and age. I don't think it's a very simplistic manner or something that can be really answered off the top of your head, but these kinds of restrictions already exist within, when it comes to Mecca and Medina. And so, but again, it's a restriction not based on race. It's not a restriction based on ethnicity. As soon as someone accepts Islam, then Dar al-Islam is their home. They're welcome to come to Dar al-Islam. That's different from other countries. That's different from ethno-states like Israel. You can't convert into Judaism, for example. Okay, you can't convert into an ethnicity. Judaism is an ethnicity. Being a Jew is an ethnic identity, and Jews will acknowledge this. 50% of Jews don't believe in God. They're atheists. So then what makes them a Jew? They're a Jew because of the matrilineal bloodline. Their mothers are Jewish, and that's what makes them Jewish, and that's having that bloodline is what allows them to have a home in Israel, of course, that they stole. But when it comes to Muslims, it's not about blood. It's not about ethnicity. Dar al-Islam is not an ethno-state. It's based on acceptance of the truth. And so restriction into Dar al-Islam is based on, are you accepting the truth or not? Okay, see how beautiful that is, and see how wise that is. Because the character of a country is going to be affected by the people who are able to come and go, right? So no question about that. I mean, that's a truism, Okay, that is a truism, that the character of a society is affected by who is allowed to come into that society. When it comes to Dar al-Islam, when it comes to Islam, that kind of restriction on movement, on people's movements into Dar al-Islam, is based on truth. But look at the immigration laws in the secular states of today. In the secular states of today, where you are born is highly determinative of how you can move from one place to another. Where you were born or who your parents are. So, for example, I am ethnically Persian. Okay, my parents, both mother and father, are from Iran. So I'm able to travel to Iran based off of that, purely based on that kind of bloodline. I can also travel in the United States. I can travel to Canada. I can travel to Mexico. I can travel to certain European countries because of a United States citizenship. But that's just purely based on where I have been born. That's not something that I can control. That's not something that has any effect on the way that I think or my ideology or what I'm more or less likely to endorse. These are just facts and attributes about who I am. But in Islam, movement and immigration is based on what you believe. You believe in the truth. Do you accept the truth? Do you practice the truth? Do you practice justice? So that's a very big difference. That shows the superiority of the Sharia, the superiority of the Islamic model as opposed to the secular nation state model, which is arbitrary. And so why should it matter that where you're born determines where you can travel and how you can move across this earth? So these are important distinctions to make. And unfortunately, the Muslim world, some of these countries have adopted the nation state model, and they restrict immigration and they restrict movement. Like many of these countries that were not accepting Muslim refugees. These are Muslims from Syria, they're Muslims from Yemen, they're Muslims from these places in the world that need a home because they have been violently displaced through occupation. And Palestinian refugees, how much difficulty do Palestinians have in Egypt or in some of these countries that are not accepting them? So this is sad, unfortunately, and it's not because Muslims want this, it's because these Muslim states, many of them are being dictated and run by agents of the secular liberal West. That's what's going on. Okay, so that's enough about white nationalism. I want to get into some of the specifics with the New Zealand shooting and the unanswered questions. So, as I mentioned before, unanswered questions, we should be willing to ask these questions now. Right now is the time where Muslims are in the most state of distress and grief, and we are worried about our safety. We're worried, is this going to happen again? Is there someone else that can cause us harm? Are other people being inspired to act in this way? So we have to, as responsible individuals, we have to ask these kinds of questions, because that's in the benefit, that's for the benefit of the Ummah, that's for the benefit of our community, that's for the benefit of our families. We can't. So unfortunately, what some people will say is that, oh, now is not the time to talk about this. Now is not the time to talk about this. No, that's not true. This is the time to ask questions, because we have to make sure that we don't fall into certain traps. We don't shoot ourselves in the foot. We don't adopt certain kinds of ideas that will later come to bite us back. So this is very important, to ask certain questions and not just accept the narrative that is given to us. So I wrote an article on MuslimSkeptic.com last Saturday, which I titled Oddities in New Zealand Muslim Mass Shooting Case. So this is not like everything that I found odd about the shooting, but what I did is I did an analysis of the manifesto, looked at exactly what was being described in there, some inconsistencies I'll describe to you and talk to you about, and also this issue of multiple shooters. Were there multiple shooters in this event? What we have heard so far, or what we are hearing now, is that this was the action of one radicalized shooter who live streamed the massacre. But the early reports were showing that there are multiple shooters. Police were saying that there are multiple suspects that they were chasing. And in fact, even later, the Washington Post was reporting that 2 others have been arrested in connection with the shootings. And the second man, 18-year-old Daniel John Burrow, was scheduled to appear in court later Saturday and face charges of inciting racial hostility or ill will. And a third accomplice remain unidentified. Okay, so this is what the Washington Post is saying. Also interesting, the Washington Post noted that the court hearing for the alleged shooter, Brenton Tarrant, was closed to the public, but this was something unusual to close the court hearing from the public. So here are some of the early reports. New Zealand police reporting the possibility of 3 active shooters in the Christchurch mosque attacks. The security analyst Paul Buchanan, who was brought on mainstream media to give his opinion on Friday of the shooting, he was saying that he has seen the gunman's manifesto and the shooting is clearly a case of a white supremacist. And he says the shooter would likely have had support in carrying out the attack. Okay. So other reports showing that people were arrested. And so multiple shooters are often reported by police. I remember over 3 years ago, I forgot the exact date, the San Bernardino shooting that happened, I think it was 2015. This was a shooting that took place in California, and it was alleged that a Muslim man and his wife went and killed about 15 people, 12 or 15 people. And that case was, I thought, very fishy. There were many unanswered questions. I was arguing that they're blaming this Muslim couple for the shooting, but there are many contradictions in the case that's being presented in the mainstream news. And so I wrote about that extensively. If you go to muslimskeptic.com, you can find articles I wrote in that case. And I thought that there was many things fishy. And one thing that I pointed to is that police were reporting multiple shooters and multiple eyewitnesses who were there in the facility that the shooting took place, reported and were on camera reporting to police that they saw 3 men dressed in military fatigues with their weapons who came to the building, conducted their shooting, and then they escaped in their car. So this is eyewitness reports. And the same thing is happening or did happen with this New Zealand shooting, with eyewitnesses saying that there were multiple people that they had seen. And so I can't go through all of the evidence, but in this case, there's actually video. There's video that someone had taken on their smartphone that shows people in that area of Christchurch with semi-automatic weapons fleeing. So let's look at that. Okay, so you see these two men here. Their faces are covered, and they're running away with their guns. So you can see this is actually a pretty large weapon. And the thing about New Zealand and Australia as well is that they have very strict gun laws. And so for people to just have these kinds of weapons in that same area is a pretty big coincidence. Is a pretty big coincidence that you have individuals running around with these very large, it seems like semi-automatic firearms. So I think that's a question. So who is this individual? Who are these two individuals? Are police looking into that? Who were they? Why were they carrying weapons? Were they at all involved or in contact with the main suspect? And then there was even pictures. Here's a picture of a police arrest. This is a guy in full military gear who was at the same place in Christchurch. What was he doing there? Who is he? Why are police arresting him? Was he released? So questions like this, I think, are very relevant. And again, I'm not showing you all of the different links and pictures and video that have been compiled. That's the thing about social media and everyone having a smartphone. It's very easy for just a random citizen, a random person on the street to just record. And then that gets online and then it spreads, and then these kinds of questions arise. Why are there people at the exact same time that this mass shooting is taking place within this one particular city, which is not like it's a military city or it's like a military base there? Why are these men running around with military fatigues, with semi-automatic weapons, just covering their face, masked? The police didn't get to the area of didn't get to the masjid, the Al Nur Masjid, where the most people were killed, where the most Muslims were killed. It took them 30 minutes to get to that, to the site of the shooting. So that's another question. Why did it take them that long when, if you look at the map, the police department is just a couple of blocks away from the masjid? And so it shouldn't have taken more than 10 minutes to get there, but it took much longer. So Allahu A'lam. Again, these are just things that to reflect on. But if it took the police that long to get to that area, then it's not like there were just concerned citizens who are trying to help, who are grabbing their, machine gun or their semi-automatic rifle, putting on the military gear and going out to help, right? And going out to contribute to getting the bad guy. So if they weren't doing that, it's implausible that that's what they were doing, then why were they there? These are important questions. But you won't find investigation of that in the mainstream media. Other questions, other unanswered questions. Where was this guy, this Brenton guy, where was he trained? Where was he trained? And it's very apparent from the video. If you saw the video, you could have noted this. I'm not encouraging you to go watch the video necessarily, because it can be very disturbing and traumatic, actually. But if you did see it, that didn't look like a random citizen who had just been radicalized by the internet, who just went and picked up his gun and went on a shooting spree. This was a trained killer. The person who gunned down the Muslims in that masjid was a trained killer. And that's apparent from a number of things. Number one, the way that he was moving through the masjid and the way that he was strafing his movements, his reload. So he was taking cover when he was reloading his gun. That's something that professionals will learn and will train on, to be able to control a building and control an area in the way that he did, looking for cover and so forth. That is something that an average person can't just pick up and do. It requires military training. But this is not a part of the guy's biography. All of the news media reporting on this say that he was a personal trainer. He was working at a gym, and he wasn't part of the Australian army. He didn't have military service, but he went and traveled from 2011 to 2018 all over the world. We're going to get to that. So where did he get that kind of military training? Also, the fact that he was very calm. Someone to be able to kill that many people is not a trivial thing. Like, it requires certain kind of nerves, like a trained killer, like a trained military personnel, to be able to engage in that kind of massacre in a very calm, cold way. The average person, okay, who has no experience would not be able to do that. And 49 people killed, that's a huge number. Okay, that's a huge amount of people to be able to kill without any kind of training, without any kind of background. And the way that he was shooting was very targeted. Again, that made it seem like he had extensive training and experience and background. And I think also interesting to bring up is the fact that the president of Turkey, Erdogan, also noted this. He said that this wasn't an individual act. Erdogan said this himself, and I'll show you the article. 1 second. Okay, so this article is about Turkey sending delegation to New Zealand after a terror attack. And at the end, let's see. So then this is what Erdogan says. The manifesto that the terrorists released clearly shows that this was no individual act. Okay. So even Erdogan is asking some questions, contrary to the media reports. Okay. And then the other thing that the Turkish officials said was that he was in Turkey, the shooter, the alleged shooter, was in Turkey for 43 days. And they claimed that he was in Turkey perhaps because, for an assassination attempt. Allahu Alam, but this is what the Turkish intelligence was reporting. So question number 1, where was he trained? Where did he get his training? So the thing is that he was traveling to numerous countries that a tourist wouldn't really travel to. Okay, so these countries included Pakistan. Okay, let me show you a screenshot of that. Okay, New Zealand mosque shooter visited Pakistan in 2018. And here's a picture of him, as a tourist. I don't know who took this picture, but there were multiple pictures of his trip to Pakistan. Then other countries, he traveled to North Korea. Which is bizarre. I don't know why or how he was able to travel to North Korea, but this is what some of the news outlets were reporting. He traveled to Turkey, as I mentioned. He traveled to parts of Africa, Portugal, Spain, France, Afghanistan. So he's going to Afghanistan. Why? That's not a typical tourist destination. Here's the screenshot from the news on him visiting North Korea. Christchurch mosque shooting, alleged Australian shooter remembered as relatively normal, visited North Korea before the attack. So that's not like what a typical tourist would do. Like, these are not typical tourist destinations. And how is he getting, the visa to go to North Korea? How is he getting the visa to go to Afghanistan? Right? Let me show you this. This is from The Independent. Request for information about the gunman. Wait, am I sharing this? Yeah. Request for information about the gunman by the intelligence agencies of New Zealand and Australia to foreign counterparts has led to the tracing of a man using that name of the shooter visiting Europe, as well as Gilgit-Baltistan in Pakistan, bordering Kashmir, also the Wakhan corridor in Afghanistan, and also in China, the Xinjiang region of China. So he's going to all of these places. He's going to Pakistan, he's going to Kashmir, bordering Kashmir, he's going to Xinjiang, he's going to North Korea. And there are other reports as well that I think I remember seeing him also traveling to Israel as well. I don't have the exact link. Let me actually look this up. Just bear with me here. He definitely mentioned Israel. He mentions that Israel is, he has no problem with Israel, and as long as Jews are in Israel, he's fine with that. It doesn't really contradict anything that he believes in. So he's traveling to all these places. That seems like a big question. Okay, so this is claiming, I have to verify this if this is like a legitimate source, but it looks legitimate, like a legitimate news source. I saw it in different places, but this is saying that he visited Israel in 2016. Two Israeli officials reported this, that in October of 2016 he was in Israel. So this is, again, not a typical tourist pattern of activity to visit these specific countries. If it's true, like that he was just radicalized online, how can you come to that conclusion when he's traveling to these areas where there is a lot of conflict and there is a lot of military activity? Big questions. Okay, what else? Other questions. So initial reports also said that there were explosives in cars that the police had to defuse. So this is something that was reported initially, but then we don't really hear much about it afterwards. The same thing was reported in San Bernardino back in 2015. That in addition to shooting in that location, there was cars that had explosives in them, and the police had to defuse those explosives. The same thing with the Boston Marathon bombing. Initial reports from the police said that there were explosives that were in the cars, were in several different locations that they had to defuse. And so this is a pattern that we see of explosives being reported, but then it seems like they're forgotten about, or there's not much discussion of how these shooters are able to conduct this very complex operation of placing explosives in different locations and then going, parking multiple cars and then going into a getaway car, going and doing these very complex maneuvers. How is just a random person radicalized online able to engage in this kind of behavior? And so here's the report This is from the early police report. I believe this is an archive of The Guardian, or maybe The Independent. But several guns have been recovered from both mosques. 2 explosive devices were found on two vehicles, not just one, 2 vehicles at the scene, and one has been disabled. Yeah. The suspects were unknown to police. Bush said the attack was very well planned. The police remain vigilant but are not looking for anyone else in connection with the attacks. Why? Why are they able to come to such a conclusive point where they say, we're not looking for anyone else? This was just a lone wolf. This was just a lone guy who planned everything. He planted. How can you even arrive at that conclusion the same day of the attack? You're not going to maybe like run some fingerprints, or maybe like go to the guy's house or his apartment and maybe go and see if his family is hiding anything, interview them, maybe do some police work, maybe track his internet activity, maybe go and get his PC, go through his files, maybe see his emails and see if he's communicating anyone, maybe see if he's communicating with anyone in these countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan and North Korea. You think maybe like you can do some background check or That's another thing people pointed out, is that this is a guy who has acquired a lot of weapons. He's stockpiled these huge guns, and he's traveling to these, conflict areas of the world. So that should have been a major red flag for any intelligence agency in Australia, in New Zealand, anywhere in the world, any intelligence agency that is seeing like this kind of movement across countries, from airport to airport, different parts of the world, conflict areas. And then it's also he's purchasing these kinds of weapons, then that should have raised a lot of red flags. But the fact that it didn't, that in itself is a red flag. Okay. Let me just stop for questions or comments. Yeah, I recommend that, again, the whole point of this unanswered questions is we can be skeptical, we can ask questions, and there's information that you can find online. Okay, YouTube looks like there was a lot of comments. Anti Haspara says he was clearly Mossad. Allahu Alam. Looks like YouTube, they're just having their own discussion on something. Can't really follow. Let's go to Facebook. Yeah, hopefully I'm getting better with addressing your questions in the chat. I think it's important to answer your questions. For some reason, Facebook doesn't let me scroll back to see all of the different questions. Sayyid Shah says, Assalamu alaikum, brother. Wa alaikum assalam. Reg says, yes, explosives found on another vehicle, so it's strange they released other suspects. Yeah, exactly. These suspects that were arrested, then they were released. Why? Doesn't it seem strange that you have a guy who is wearing military fatigues like this? He even has like some soot or something on his face, right? Yeah, or as if he had like used some kind of coloring on his face to mask himself. So why are these random people in the Christchurch area at the time of the shooting? And here you have this police officer who's booking him. Are we not allowed to ask questions about this stuff? Okay, so then the manifesto. I focused on the manifesto initially because I hadn't gotten a lot of this information when I was first writing on it. But the manifesto is 73 pages. I'm not going to go into uh, reading large portions of it because YouTube might, or Facebook, they might delete the video. There's a lot of censorship that's been going on. Okay, so the things that really struck me about the manifesto, first of all, uh, the language convention between English and or between Australian and American English, there were inconsistencies. So in some areas he's using American English, like American spelling, and in other places he's using Australian spelling conventions. So I gave examples in the article of, and it's consistent, right? Sometimes you have the IZE ending, so pulverized, industrialized, globalized, radicalized, energized, strategized, realized, utilized, finalized, all of these things. The American spelling is IZE. The Australian spelling, and I think in the UK as well, and Canada, is ISE. ISE. So, you can confirm with the Australian English Dictionary, Macquarie's Dictionary online. But why? Why is there? Why he was born and raised in Australia, educated in Australia. So why is he using these kinds of American conventions? So, I mean, you could excuse that. There could be a reason. It might be he had an American teacher, or maybe he's just used to reading things like that online, the American spelling, because he's mostly reading U.S. media. Maybe that'd be strange, but that's one possibility. But the thing is, he's not consistently using the English or the American spelling conventions. Other times, he's using the Australian convention. Okay, like when he uses words like labor with OU spelling instead of just the O, rumors, color, honors, endeavors. Yeah, all of this. So whenever there's an OR ending in the manifesto, he is using the Australian convention. So that's very consistent. But it's strange that you'd be using Australian for one set of endings and then American English for another set of word endings. So just an oddity. Another thing that I found very strange about the manifesto itself, when you read it, it doesn't look like a manifesto. It looks like a copy paste job, in the sense that it's very disjointed. Someone who's writing a manifesto, who wants to get his ideas to the world and communicate in the most effective way, is going to write a detailed manifesto, a coherent manifesto. And this is what we see with people like the Unabomber, or we see with individuals who engaged in this mass shooting and took the time to release a manifesto. Usually it's coming from a kind of a narcissistic personality, or a very, self-centered personality that, I'm on a mission. I'm on a mission to save the world, and this is why I'm justified in what I'm doing. And they're going to write in depth, and they're going to try to put their best writing forward, their best work forward as a representative. This is, in their minds, this is their legacy to the world. This is what they're going to be remembered by if they get killed in the shooting. And so they put time and effort into it, and it reads like, of varying qualities, but at least there's an attempt. But this manifesto, is titled the Great Replacement, meaning the replacement of white people with immigrants, is full of spelling errors, is full of these kinds of language inconsistencies, is full of grammatical errors, and it's not a complete essay. It's not like a contiguous essay. It's just paragraphs that are not related. There's no transition from one topic to the other. So it's very disjointed, and it doesn't come across as a kind of manifesto that someone who is concerned about their legacy and wants to communicate to the world their ideas, it doesn't come across like that at all. It comes across as just copy pasting stuff. Also, what struck me immediately when reading the manifesto was that he doesn't really have any animosity towards Jews. Why is this significant? Why does he kind of seems to promote Jews and say that, I have no problem. I'm not an anti-Semite. A Jew living in Israel is no enemy of mine so long as they do not seek to subvert or harm my people. So this is significant because he claims to have his beliefs were developed from the internet. Like he explicitly says this in the manifesto. From where did you receive, research, and develop your beliefs? And he says the internet. Because you'll not find the truth anywhere else. Okay, so if that's the case, if the internet is what radicalized him, there's one very clear feature of internet discourse, white nationalist internet discourse, and that is its anti-Semitism. It's highly anti-Semitic. It's very anti-Jew. And you can go to some of these forums that have been mentioned on mainstream media, like 8chan, 4chan, Gab, Daily Stormer, these kinds of websites that have been censored. But if you are able to go on them, you'll see that it's all about Jews. They have this obsession with a Jewish conspiracy to undermine the white race, to undermine white people through immigration. So this is something that you find on all of the white nationalist online discourse, but it's missing in his manifesto. He doesn't mention Jews as conspiring against the white race. He doesn't mention Jews or Jewish policy to flood the Western world with immigrants, with brown people. These are the things that the white nationalists online are constantly promoting and constantly railing against the Jews. So that anti-Semitism is so pronounced and foregrounded in that discourse, but there's none of that within the manifesto. And I think that that's noteworthy. That's something to wonder at, as why, if that indicates that, okay, maybe it wasn't just online radicalization, if that's what we want to believe. What are the other sources that have affected his way of thinking, and the kind of memes, for example, that he put in the manifesto, or within the video, the live stream of his shooting, when he says something like subscribe to PewDiePie, which is a YouTube, the largest YouTube channel in the world is PewDiePie, and he makes this kind of joke, which is a white nationalist joke because PewDiePie is white. So if it was just the internet, it's very odd. And the analogy that I made is that imagine you have someone writing a manifesto about how amazing the Chicago Bulls were in the 90s. 73 pages of how amazing, the Bulls, the basketball team, the NBA basketball team were and dominated the NBA in the 90s. And they write 70 pages of that, but they don't once mention Michael Jordan. They don't once mention Michael Jordan. It would seem very strange. It would seem odd. It seemed like they were deliberately trying to avoid mentioning Michael Jordan. So, again, these are just questions. I'm not trying to say that, like someone mentioned in the comments, or multiple people, like, oh, this is something that Mossad did, the Israeli intelligence. That's something that we can't really comment on because the facts are, as of now, unknown. Like, there's all these unanswered questions. And so we can't really speculate. We just have to ask the questions, and we have to point out whenever the mainstream narrative is inconsistent. Some people don't care about any of this, right? Some people don't care about delving into these details, and they find it very disturbing, and they find it very traumatic to go into these kinds of details. But we have a responsibility. Some people within the Ummah have to be concerned about this and have to be able to think a little bit more critically or a little bit more skeptically, because the discourse can be used against us, and we can fall into this trap about saying things and accepting things that later will be used against us. So we want to be critical. We want to look at the facts and verify things as being true or not. And that's all I'm trying to do. And hopefully you find benefit in that and you see the value of that. Okay, so the unanswered questions, again, I just raised 4 or 5, but I'm sure you can think of others, or you might see things that I noticed, I missed. You might have noticed things that I missed. Where was he trained? Why was he traveling to all these bizarre countries, these conflict areas leading up to the shooting, including North Korea, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Israel, and so forth? What happened to the explosives that were in these cars? Why is this coordinated attack, this complex coordinated attack, are we certain that there's only one person involved? If so, then why did police say that they had other suspects? Why is the Washington Post referring to this person's name, the Daniel Burrow person, as being in court as well for inciting violence and racism? So these are all questions that we should be able to ask. We should look at the manifesto and be able to analyze it as well. Okay, now let me just do a final look over questions. Oh, ABCDF contributed $1 in the super chat. Okay, wow. I think that's the first super chat this channel has received. So Jazakallah khaira. I appreciate the £1. That will go a long way if you feel compelled or feel inspired to contribute to the super chat. I really appreciate that, and it really helps the YouTube algorithm to direct more people to the channel and get this kind of message out there. So I appreciate it. And you really kept it anonymous. You said A, B, C, D, E, F. Don't want anyone to know who you are contributing to this, but nonetheless, I appreciate it. Yeah. Avi says, if you go on that song now on YouTube and click latest comments, all you see is Islamophobic comments and mention of the killer. Yeah, I mean, these are white nationalists. They're disgusting people. Their views are very disgusting and vile, and they're celebrating the killing of Muslims. So, we should hate this. We should hate people talking like this. Absolutely. And they want to consider themselves enemies of the Ummah. And this is not the first time. And that's why we refer back to the Sahaba. The Sahaba were also fighting against the kuffar. They're fighting against enemies of Islam who hated them because of their iman. So that's still a reality today. And we have to have that sense of wala wal bara, al-wala wal bara, loyalty and disavowal. We have to have this, what I call Ummah first mentality. And we should hate that people are talking like this. And we can oppose them. But always remember that Islam, we're calling people to Islam. And no matter how vile a person is and their current state, they can be guided. And Allah can straighten their hearts. And Allah can put light into their heart. And so we have to be open to that. We have to be calling people to a better way. Brother Yusuf also contributed $5. Jazakallah khaira in the super chat. Really appreciate that. Thank you for your support as always. Okay, any other questions? I'm just trying to go through all of these entertaining comments. Yeah, I'm trying to make sure your comments are kosher, guys. This is important. I don't want my channel to be banned and deleted because of commenters. So I only accept kosher comments. Okay, and then within Facebook, Reg says Ummah first mentality is greatly lacking. Yeah, unfortunately, we do have a lack in some parts of the Ummah. I don't say all, because there are many strong Muslims throughout the Ummah who do have Ummah first, do have al-wala wal-bara, and they are practicing that, and we want to be like them, and we want to encourage that, and that's very important. So let's not have despair. Let's not have any kind of bad thoughts about the Ummah as a whole. We always want to describe and talk about the Ummah in positive terms. This is something that I have to learn, and I'm trying to get better at, is that we describe the Ummah as a whole in positive terms. We don't say that, oh, the Ummah is destroyed, or oh, the Ummah is, we're failing in so many ways. Don't speak in generalities, because you're talking about something that Allah has praised. Allah has praised the believers. Allah has praised the Ummah. And so who are we to say something negative about the Ummah? Yes, there are problems, and so we limit it and we qualify. And you'll notice that this is what I try to do. Some within the Ummah, some parts of the community, some areas, some individuals. I don't make statements like, oh, these imams don't know what they're talking about. Oh, these scholars are out of touch. No, because you're making a very general statement to say that ulama are out of touch. No, some of them are out of touch. The minority, the majority are doing good. The majority are doing the right thing. The majority are leading us to the right path. We have to have a positive outlook on the ummah, on these groups of people that Allah has praised and has set to lead us. So just be aware. This is something that I had to learn because I was falling into this kind of mistake as well. And then my teachers corrected me on this. Is like don't make broad brush statements about the ummah or about the ulama or about imams. This is not appropriate, and it's something that you should watch yourself. So I'm just passing on that nasiha to you all as well. Okay, let me make sure there's nothing else that I want to mention. No? Okay, well, I hope that this was informative and you were able to get some new thoughts and ideas. Again, I appreciate everyone who was tuning in, and definitely appreciate all of the super chats. Oh, there was one other one. KJ contributed £2. Jazakallah khair. Well, you guys are giving me these super chats, but you're not making any comments. I thought that was the whole point of the super chat, is I'm going to read your chat. All you said is, KJ says UWU. I don't know what that refers to, but again, I appreciate it. Oh, here's an interesting comment from Bodyguard. Yesterday, a Turk carried out a quote-unquote terror attack in the Netherlands. Tomorrow, there are elections in the Netherlands, and the far-right parties are using this incident to incite anti-migrant Muslim hate. Yeah, I mean, this is what they're doing all the time. They're trying to point out examples of Muslims doing this or that, but they don't point out to all of the crimes that are committed by people of multiple different religions, various religions. And so they have to promote this kind of anti-Muslim sentiment, and they avoid all of the good things that Muslims contribute to these countries. What are the positives that Muslims are contributing to European nations? Oftentimes when we talk about this, people want to focus on, oh, well, there are so many Muslim doctors and there are so many Muslim engineers living in America and in Europe. Yeah, sure, that's good. Those are good things. But that shouldn't be the priority. Like, again, we have to prioritize the things like Iman, the things like Islam, as opposed to dunyawi type of considerations. Muslims are contributing the truth. Muslims are contributing goodness, justice. Muslims are contributing family values. Muslims are contributing this idea of strong marriages, having children, a strong family. Okay, family ties, maintaining family ties, birr al-walidain, being good to your parents, right? Charity, sadaqah. This is what Muslims are contributing, and we continue to increase this. Being good to your neighbor. Okay, these are Islamic values. Being good to your neighbor. Again, it doesn't matter if it's a Muslim or non-Muslim neighbor. We're good to our neighbors. We help our neighbors. We're good to guests. We are good to orphans. We are good to the weak. Okay? These are things that we are contributing to these nations. And the main benefit to nations that Muslims bring is calling to Islam. That is the main benefit. We're calling to the truth. Okay? So those who are opposing Muslims and want to, expel Muslims, they're making a big mistake for their own dunya and akhirah. So we always have to put things in that right perspective, and lest we forget, lest we fall into the mindset that, what all that Muslims contribute is we have some doctors and we have some engineers, and Muslims get education, and so we're contributing in that way. Yeah, that's fine. You can talk about that, but also talk about these other aspects that will foreground Islam and prioritize Islam. Okay. So, Jazakallah khairah. Everyone, thank you for tuning in. Tune in next week at the same time. I think we might have a guest next week. And if so, I'll announce that. I'll announce the new time. Check out muslimskeptic.com for more articles and insights. And also check out alesna.org, which is my learning academy, online learning academy, where you can take classes, courses online, pre-recorded. And you can find more information at alesna.org. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.